Okay, turning your Bibles to the book of Ruth, which is right after the book of Judges in the Old Testament. It's a very small book, so it's kind of hard to find. So it's between Judges and 1 Samuel. Last time I taught, we were finishing the Red Letter series, the Words of Jesus. And since we taught through the New Testament for a while, I thought we'd go back to the Old Testament. There's I don't know, most people that read the Bible kind of have some favorite books. In the Old Testament, my four favorite books are all kind of story books. They're Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, and Ruth. And when I was thinking about what to teach next, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel, myself or pastor, have taught those books here in the last 2 or 3 years. But we haven't really touched on the book of Ruth. There's 2 books in the Old Testament that are named after women, Ruth and Esther. And then this is the only book in the Old Testament that's named after a non-Jew. So kind of a unique book. It's a little 4-chapter book, and if you look back to ancient Jewish writings of the Old manuscripts, that's the word I was seeking for, manuscripts of the Old Testament, Ruth and Judges were actually put together. They were not separated. More modern translators have separated them. But it's a little book that many say is one of the most moving short stories that you'll ever read. And certainly I would say Esther and Ruth are both just incredibly moving short stories. Wouldn't take you 20 minutes to read either one of them. I think you ought to try that. It's amazing what these two books have. But tonight we're going to look at the book of Ruth. The time of this story is about 3,000 years ago. So right now we're a little over 2,000 years from the time of Christ, and so before Christ, this was actually about 1100 BC, about 1100 years before Christ. So when Israel had completed their 40 years of wandering after leaving Egypt, then they crossed into Canaan, and before they were ruled by kings, they were ruled by judges, because God said He wanted to be their king, and so instead God gave them a series of judges. And so the book of Judges is about the work and the times of those judges. Now, the very last judge was Samuel. He's also the most famous judge. Samuel was considered not just to be a judge, he was also a prophet, and he was a priest. And so he also, besides being a judge, a prophet, and a priest, he's the one who anointed the first king of Israel, Saul, and then a little later he anointed the second king of Israel, David. So Samuel's a very, very important figure in the Old Testament. Anyway, we believe Samuel wrote the books of Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel. So he wrote these 4 books. Now, like I said, in the original Jewish manuscripts of the Old Testament, Judges and Ruth are not separated. And so I think as we kind of begin, and what we're going to do at first here is kind of look at the background to help us understand the setting of the book of Ruth. I think it'll make a lot more sense to you. So, first of all, what let's do is read the last, if you have your book open there, or it's there on your lesson sheet, we're going to read the last verse in the book of Judges and read the first verse in the book of Ruth, because they actually tell us what's going on here. So the last verse in Judges 21:25, they're on your lesson sheet. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then Ruth 1:1, which in the old Jewish manuscripts was immediately following. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So when you read all that together, it tells us that the last verse in Judges, that this was a lawless time in Israel. Even though they had judges ruling them, they had really fallen away from following God, and it says everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. That remind you of a time that's happening today, perhaps? You see stuff on the news where everybody's doing what they think is right in their own eyes, and what the law says doesn't matter. So that's what it was like back then. And then the first verse in Ruth says, and there was a famine in the land. So you put these two things together, and so let's talk about famines for a minute. In ancient times, famines were actually fairly common. You know, we live in what's called an industrial society. And if you remember from American history, the Industrial Revolution, when you know, man kind of started putting factories together for people to come work in factories, was about 200 years ago. Before that, pretty much the whole world, the basis of most economies was agricultural. So it was an agricultural economy. Certainly there were some people that had trades. You know, you might have a baker, or you might have a person that shoed horses, a blacksmith. In fact, if your ancestors are from England, you know, your last name is probably reflective of what the trade was of your family, because trades were passed down from father to son to son to son to son, because there were no trade schools. You just passed down what you knew. You know, if your last name is Miller, that means that your ancestors over in Europe, probably in England, milled grain. They had those water mills that would mill grain, so that's where the millers came from. If your last name is Taylor, that meant that you actually sewed cloth for things. So whether it's for clothes, whether it's for curtains or upholstery, a tailor was a tailor. So of course that most people who are named Taylor today is Taylor, but back then it was Tailor. If your last name is Smith, that means your ancestors were blacksmiths. And so those Miller, Taylor, Smith, and Jones are kind of the four most common surnames in America. I'm a Jones, but I don't know what my ancestors did other than just make babies, because there's a bunch of us. Anyway, but I never have figured out what our trade was. Anyway, so the point is, from more than 200 years ago back to Bible times, pretty much every economy was based on agriculture, farming and growing crops, and having animals, ranching, you know, herds and flocks of animals. And so what would happen is, from time to time there'd be a famine. Now, a famine could be caused by several things. A famine can be caused by lack of rainfall. And so you may remember about, 7 or 8 years ago, we had about a 3-year drought here. And it was terrible. But thankfully, because we are an industrial society, that didn't affect us to where we all starved. But in the old times of agricultural societies, if you depended on the land for growing your food, and you depend on the land for feeding your crops and herds, if there was no rainfall, you're going to get real hungry for a while till the rainfall came again. So famines could be caused by lack of rainfall. They could be caused by destructive hailstorms or heavy rain out of season. You know, maybe you're a farmer and you've just got a crop that's just come up, and the last thing you need is a torrential rain that washes it all out. So if that happens to a lot of people, then obviously that can affect the crops of that whole area and cause a famine. Famines can be caused when crops are destroyed by pests. So you could have a lot of really good-looking crops, and here come swarms and swarms of grasshoppers or some other, or in the days of cotton, the boll weevils. You could have crops just wiped out by insects. And of course, if that was the basis of your economy, then that would cause a famine. And then another way, and this was especially common in the olden days, was a famine could be caused by siege, S-E-I-G-E. So what would happen was most of those areas were what we call city-states. They didn't have big nations. They just kind of, a city would kind of have a king, and they have a wall around the city, and then some people live out in the country, but when the enemy came, they all came into the walled city for protection. Well, if the enemy was strong enough, what they would just surround them, and rather than fight and lose men, they would just surround them so they couldn't leave the city. Anybody tried to leave the city, they'd kill them. And so often a famine can be caused by siege because the people inside didn't have access to their crops and their herds that were outside the city walls. And that happened many times that we read about in the Old Testament and in ancient history. I was a medical missionary in Nigeria in the late 70s, and 10 years before I went there, those of you who are as old as me or older may remember Life magazine having pictures of the children of Biafra. And in Nigeria, there's lots of different tribes. There was one major tribe that decided they wanted to secede from the nation because they had a lot of the oil wells and a lot of the wealth and a lot of the educated people, and they thought, we don't need all these other folks, so let's just become our own nation. Well, the rest of the nation in Nigeria didn't like that, so they just surrounded them and starved them out till they gave in. It took 2 or 3 years, but finally they just had to give in because they'd eaten all the food and crops within their small state, but they could not get out because they'd be killed. So that was a siege. So sieges can actually still happen today. So those are the ways that a famine can happen. But when you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of scriptures where God tells the Israelites that if they don't continue to follow His commands and obey Him, He will send a famine as punishment. And so when you put the last verse of Judges and the first verse of Ruth together, it kind of looks to me like this is what was happening here. Because the last verse of Judges said everybody was doing what they wanted to do, not following the law. And then first verse of Ruth says, and there was a famine in the land. So that looks like to me like God had actually brought this famine upon the people. Okay, so we start the book of Ruth. There's a famine in the land. And I don't know, have you ever experienced a famine or, hunger? We're really in a blessed country. And, not many of us have missed too many meals. I asked my dad one time, who lived through the Depression. He was a teenager in the Depression. And I knew that in the Depression and the Dust Bowl, which there was a drought, and so there are not many crops. I asked him, if they starved, if they were just really hungry for food. And he grew up in a little town called Bonham in northeast Texas. And a little town of about 8,000 people, but he said they lived on the edge of town and had about 5 acres. So even though his dad was a carpenter and built houses, and this was, of course, before electric power tools, so every house was built by, every nail was put in by the hammer, and every board was cut with a saw. But he said they had a cow for milk. They always had 2 or 3 pigs that they would slaughter in the fall and then put in the smokehouse, so they always had meat. And then he said they had about a 2-acre garden, which is a big garden. And so his mother and the older kids would can food. So he said, we never starved. But he said the people who didn't have that, who didn't have access to kind of grow their own food, really did have a hard time. And we know that certainly in the big cities back in the Depression, where they didn't have gardens, everybody kind of depended on a job, and there was no jobs. There was a lot of starvation in America back then. Anyway, so here we have in Ruth 1:1, the people are starving in Israel. And so what happens is there's a man and his wife and his 2 sons, and they decide to leave and go find a place that's got some food. So certainly if you are the head of a household and your family's starving and there's no way to get food where you are, you're going to look for a place where you can have something to eat. You don't want to starve to death. So let's look at verse 2. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Okay, now's the time to look at your map. Okay, on the right side of your handout is the map of Israel. The Mediterranean Sea is out in here. Down the middle is the Jordan River. At the little circle near the top is the Sea of Galilee, and then the big long kind of circular area at the bottom is the Dead Sea. So the Jordan River runs to the Dead Sea. And so most of the tribes of Israel are over here between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And then if you look, I've got yellow highlighted Bethlehem, which is in the tribe of Judah. See, this is Israel broken up into the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Bethlehem is where this family lived. Where they're going is Moab in the lower right-hand corner. I've got that highlighted. So you see where they're going. Now, that's about a 50-mile walk. It's about a 50-mile walk. They have to walk around the top of the Dead Sea and then come down to the country of Moab. Now, let's talk about Moab a little bit and just kind of its history, because it really plays into our story a lot. So Moab was across the Jordan River down on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. So let's ask ourselves for a minute, who are these Moabites? Who are the people of Moab that they decide that they must have some food? And why is it that they think there's food there? Well, there's a reason. If you go back to the book of Genesis, about 1,000 years before the time of Ruth, we come to Genesis 13, and there's a story that you probably remember from Sunday school about Abraham and his nephew Lot. And remember, they were there in Canaan, in what we call the Promised Land, or Israel, and they were both being very, very prosperous. And they both had huge, huge herds. And it got to the point that there really wasn't enough grazing for both of them to graze all their herds at the same place. Do you remember what Abraham did? He took Lot up to the top of a hill and said, Lot, he said, kind of like, I love you, but, we just can't stay together like this because there's not enough grazing land for all of our herds. And the Bible records that Lot looked off to the east and saw that was a well-watered area on the east, the east side of the Jordan River, and so he picks the better of the two places. And so Lot separates from Abram, goes across the river Jordan, and over there on the east side, that's where he lives. And it says, the Bible tells us he moved near Sodom. Remember Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, if you look at your Dead Sea, Sodom is not on here because it's been demolished by the time of this map. But Sodom was on the east side of the Dead Sea, kind of about in the middle. Anyway, so that's where Lot settles. And he does that because it's greener over there, which means there's more rain over there. You get green where there's rain. That's why you get more trees where there's more rain. You go out, you go farther west out in Oklahoma, there's less and less trees because there's less and less rain. You go to the east, there's more and more trees because there's more and more rain. And so everything is greener where there's more rain. So Lot goes to the east and settles over east of the Dead Sea near Sodom. Okay, then we fast forward to Genesis 19. And you remember that story, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Lot is living there near Sodom. And God looks down on Sodom and Gomorrah, and they are so wicked. And remember, he rains down fire and brimstone on them. If you were here 2 or 3 years ago when we did the biblical archaeology study, and you can find this today on YouTube. If you go Biblical Archaeology, Sodom and Gomorrah, you will see how archaeologists have uncovered some thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of petrified brimstone that is pure sulfur. They've chemically analyzed these, and there's no place else on the entire earth that has found this pure sulfur. And sulfur burns very, very hot, and it stinks like the dickens. It smells like rotten eggs. But anyway, they found where Sodom was, And you'll see on that video, buildings that were burned, stone buildings that you could just deface because of the intense heat from that brimstone. So that's one of the archaeological proofs of the Bible. Anyway, so Lot is near there, and so if you remember the Bible story, when God starts raining down the fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot says, we got to leave. God tells him, you got to leave. I'm destroying this place. And you remember what happened? Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife take off, but God says, don't look back. But what happens to the wife? She got to have one last look, so she looks back and she turns into a pillar of salt. So you have Lot and his 2 daughters. So it says that Lot lives in a cave. The Bible tells us Lot lives in a cave. So somewhere in that area, but it's far enough away from the fire and brimstone, that he takes up residence in a cave with his 2 daughters. And so the next Bible story is one that you may not have heard of. It's not as well known. But here you have these 2 young women. We feel like they're either older teens or young women, and they have their father. And back in that society, it was critical that a father have sons to carry on the name and to carry on the lineage and to have inheritance of property. And here they had no brothers. And so the 2 daughters on different nights got Lot drunk and lay with him. And so both of them became pregnant by their father with incestuous pregnancies. And so both of them had a son. The names of those 2 sons were Moab and Amnon, or Ben-Ami, which is Amnon. So look on your map here. And so the descendants of Moab became the Moabites, the people that live in Moab. And then a little bit higher, you see the other highlighted area. You see A-M-N off the side of the map. It would say Ammon, A-M-M-O-N, Amnon. And so that was where the other son and his descendants lived. And all these things that we just talked about happened 1,000 years before the time of Ruth. Now, so that kind of gives you an idea of where the Moabites came from. Now, the Jews didn't like the Moabites or the Ammonites. In fact, they were often at odds with each other. They often had wars with each other. But in Deuteronomy 23:3, and I don't think I have this on your lesson sheet, but God, Moses is writing Deuteronomy from God's instruction. And God says in Deuteronomy 23:3, no Moabite or Ammonite may enter the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation. No Moabite or Ammonite may enter the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation. And then he tells in the next verse why. Why the Jews are not really to associate with them. And he says, when the Israelites, so Egypt, on your map, Egypt is kind of down here where my hand is. And so they left Egypt and they come up this way. And in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 23, Moses goes on to say, when you, or God saying this through Moses, when you, the Israelites, came out of Egypt, the Moabites were not hospitable to you. They did not come out to meet you with bread and water. In other words, they didn't feed you or give you anything to drink. And plus, they hired Balaam to curse you. And that's an interesting story in verse 22 where the donkey's talking. But basically, the Moabites were not friendly to the Israelites, so God said, we don't want any Moabites or Ammonites within our assembly. You just stay away from them. Now, really interesting, because God said, I don't want any Moabite or Ammonite in the assembly of the Lord for 10 generations. Now, as you know from the story, because you've probably heard the book of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth is a Moabite. We know that she's in the lineage of Christ. We'll learn in the next few chapters that she marries a Jew named Boaz. And they have a son, and basically Ruth is in the lineage of Christ in Matthew chapter 1. Well, if you look in Matthew chapter 1 where it gives the lineage of Christ all the way back to Abraham, and you count the generations, remember, no Jew, no Moabite or Ammonite to the 10th generation shall enter the assembly of the Israelites. If you start counting, Boaz is number 11. Isn't that interesting? So God, through Moses, 1,000 years before Boaz was even born and Ruth was born, knew exactly what his plan was. Is that phenomenal? Anyway, so I just thought that was an interesting thing to bring up. Okay, now let's learn a little bit more about the country of Moab. Their god was named Chemosh, Chemosh, Chemosh. And the Moabites sacrificed a lot of things to Chemosh, but one of the things they often sacrificed was their children. So they did children's sacrifices to their god. And as you know, back then, most families had lots of kids, so, we'll give one to Chemosh to make him happy with us. But isn't that terrible that they would actually sacrifice their own children to Chemosh? And so this is actually mentioned two places that are important that verify the truth of the Bible. In Numbers 21:29, it says, "Woe to you, O Moab, you are undone, O people of Chemosh." And so the Bible mentions the Moabite god as being named Chemosh. And then also, if you move over to 1st and 2nd Kings, there are several other mentions of this god Chemosh. Now look on your map page. Now look at the other image there. This is what's called the Moabite stone. And this is one of the major archaeological finds of biblical times in the entire world. It was discovered in modern times by a German missionary in 1868. He was in the area of Moab, and one of the tribal chiefs told him, "You need to go look at this. If you're looking for stuff from old times, go look at this." So he found this. This is now in that famous museum in Paris called the Louvre. It's about 4 feet tall and about 2 feet wide. It's written in the ancient Moabite language, which is very similar to Hebrew. It's a little bit different, but it's very similar to Hebrew because, they were descendants of Lot. And so their language was very similar, but it was a little bit different. Now, what's interesting is what's written. This it's not just a stone. What you can't see on the whole face is just like a story. It's a whole story written in the Moabite language. And what it does is interesting because it gives not only the name of the Moabite god Chemosh, which agrees with the Bible, it also kind of gives the Moabite side of the story of what happens in 2 Kings 3. It names Omri, who is one of the kings of Israel that's named in the Bible after there's Saul, David, and Solomon, then the kingdom divided, and there were kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so Omri was one of the kings of the northern kingdom. And so this Moabite stone mentions him because they're battling him. And it also mentions the house of David, which the house of David means the descendants of David. So again, this Moabite stone, which has nothing to do with the Bible, is talking about stuff from the Bible. So this is one of the archaeological proofs of the Bible. So don't let anybody tell you that the Bible is just a fiction fairy tale. This is absolute proof of it. So, and then I think I mentioned the Moabite stone also talks about Chemosh being their god. Okay, so that's our background. So what you see here, when we start this book of Ruth, we have her background. Okay? So we have 4 things about her background. They're there on the bottom of your lesson sheet. We have the background on her land. Her land was Moab, southeast of the Dead Sea across the Jordan, and it was a very fertile area. That's why this family went to find food there. Number 2, we have learned about her life, and it's among people who were frequent enemies of Israel and certainly not thought of well by Israelites. Number 3, we've learned about her lineage, that she was a descendant of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. And then number 2, we learned about her Lord, who was the God of the Moabites, who was Chemosh. So we learned about her land, her life, her lineage, and her Lord. Okay, now let's get into the story. And using that as a background, I think it'll make a lot more sense to you. Now, we said Prophet Samuel writes this story. It's interesting because when you read this little short story, it is written from from Naomi's perspective, the wife of Elimelech, where they went to Moab to search for food. So what scholars think is that Naomi, after all these events happened, told this story to Samuel. And then Samuel writes it down. But it's written, the whole thing is written through Naomi's eyes. Very interesting. Okay, let's look at, there on your lesson sheet, the second column. We'll look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites and from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So the family gets to Moab to find food, and apparently the famine in Israel lasts several years, so they stay there because apparently there is food in Moab. And then unexpectedly the husband dies. So the way it presents itself is that it was sort of an unexpected thing. Of course, as you probably know, life expectancy back before 200 years ago was actually quite short. The average life expectancy was about age 40 or so. And that's because so many people died of infections. There wasn't really good medical care. And so, yes, some people did live to ripe old ages, as we saw in the Bible, but lots and lots of people died young. So we have no idea what he died of, but he dies while they're in Moab, but she's got these 2 sons, and apparently the sons are young men. Okay, verse 4 and 5. These 2, Mahlon and Chilion, her 2 sons, they took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. So they lived there about 10 years, and then both Mahlon and Chilion die. So that the woman was left without her 2 sons and without her husband. So we don't know exactly what happened to them either, but they've both been married. They both married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. They continue to live there because they probably heard that the famine is still going on in Israel. Famines can last several years. And apparently neither family gets pregnant. There's no children to Orpah and Ruth that are mentioned in the story. And then for some reason, we don't know why, but Mahlon and Chilion both die. I'm sure you've heard Pastor Mike say over and over that names mean things in the Bible. And this is a really true sense here when you look at the meaning of those 2 names, the names of those unusual words, Mahlon and Chilion. So if you look at the Hebrew names of and I know they're Hebrew men, so let's look at the Hebrew names of their words. Mahlon means infirmity or sickness. So that's the meaning of his name. So his parents named him Sickness. Okay? And then Chilion in Hebrew means finished or to come to an end. So I'm not sure how they picked those names, or maybe they were unaware of the Hebrew meaning, but they named their boys Sickness and Finished. And sure enough, they both were. So be careful. Be careful how you name your kids. Years ago, I delivered a boy for a young couple, and they named him a real cute name, Rowdy. And I thought to myself, I said, you're just asking for trouble, because if that kid lives up to his name, you're in for trouble, man. Anyway, turns out he's a pretty good kid, but I thought, you got to think about how you name people and name things. Anyway, so Mahlon and Chilion live up to their names in sickness and infirmity and finished. They both die. So now we have Naomi we have Ruth and Orpah. All three are widows, and they're in Moab. And you probably heard that in ancient times a widow was in bad shape economically because, they didn't really have trades. They were dependent upon their husband. A woman's purpose in that society was basically having children and raising children. And so very, very few women actually had a job that would bring money in. So when you were a widow in those societies in those ancient times, basically you were poor, you were a pauper. And you depended on handouts, you lived by begging, and you lived by what was called gleaning. We mentioned it was an agricultural society, and so, the people, especially the Israelites, were commanded by God that when you harvest your fields, you leave some in the corners and the sides for the poor, so that they can come along and gather. Now, you don't go give it. You don't pick it up and go give it to them. They still have to come do a little work, but you leave some of the harvest for the poor that they can come and have something to eat. Maybe that's a lesson for us today. Anyway, so that's kind of what they're faced with as widows, that they're left to begging, gleaning, and handouts. Anyway, so Orpah and Ruth, the two young women, they're widows. They've been married a few years. We don't know exactly how long, but they're young and they're in their own country. But Naomi, she's getting older, and we mentioned then how a lot of people didn't live past 40. So it's a hard life, and so 40 now in this age and 40 at that age is a whole different story. And so Naomi's getting old, and she has nobody to support her, and she's in a foreign land. She's not with her people. Now, the two daughters, they're with their people, so it's not so strange for them to be widows in their land. But here, she's a foreigner in a land and she's a widow. Okay, let's read verses 6 and 7. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. It's talking about Naomi. For Naomi had heard in the fields of Moab, so see, they were gleaning. That's why they were out in the fields. She had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and had given them food. So she set out from that place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So Naomi hears that the famine in Israel is over. In other words, God has, and she's giving God credit for lifting that famine and letting his people have something to eat again. So Naomi wants to go home. And so initially, Orpah and Ruth, they loved her, and so they start the journey with her. Let's see what happens next. Verse 8 and 9. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead, meaning their husbands, and me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So they've started this 50-mile journey back to Judah. Of course, the girls had never been to Judah. They grew up in Moab. And most likely they're walking because they're paupers. They're not on a donkey or on a cart. So they're walking. And so Naomi has second thoughts about them going with her, because they're Moabites, and they may not be real welcome in Israel, because the Israelites obviously thought less of the Moabites than the Moabites felt about the Israelites. And so, she's thinking they're young, they're in their own country, they could marry again, and so, she says, y'all need to stay here. Y'all just stay here, let me go back to Israel, to my own country. So she's grateful for their kindness, she blesses them, she prays to God to watch over them, and then they weep because they love Naomi. They love their mother-in-law. Let's see what happens next in verse 10 through 14. And they say to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your own way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it's exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so both Ruth and Orpah initially want to go with Naomi, but Naomi believes it's best for them to stay in their own families with their own country, and probably knows they're not going to be real welcome back in Israel. So she tells them, I'm too old to give you new husbands. I mean, if I get a husband tonight and get pregnant and have a son, are you going to wait for him to be grown for you to marry him? I said, that's not something that you'd want to do. I mean, that'd be, 18, 20 years. And so she's implying that if they stay in Moab, they have a better chance at getting married and a better chance at some security and not have to live the life of a pauper, of a beggar. So Naomi's doing her very best to persuade these two young women, stay here. This is your home. This is your people. And so finally Orpah agrees, and Orpah kisses her, and she basically agrees to stay in Moab. But it says Ruth clung to her. Ruth is persistent. She is not going to leave Naomi. She's going to stay with Naomi and go with her back to Judah. Okay, let's turn your page and let's look at what happens next in verse 15 through 18. And Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, and you'll recognize these words, they're famous words, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more so if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Naomi could see that Ruth was not going to be dissuaded from following with her. So Ruth understands the practical wisdom that Naomi's trying to imply to her, that this is your country, you can have a husband of your own race. This is where Ruth understands that. But her love overcomes the practical wisdom. And so her love is stronger than practical wisdom. It's kind of interesting in this book where love is so strong that the actual word of love is never used in this entire book. But you can see it in words and you can see it in actions. So Ruth chooses to belong to Naomi's people and to worship Naomi's God. And so now from this point forward, the last 3 chapters, it kind of becomes Ruth's story. But it's Ruth's story through Naomi's eyes. Okay, let's look at verse 19 through 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And again, back on your map, Bethlehem back here in Judah, across the Jordan River, and about a 50-mile walk. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem, and that was the town that Naomi and Elimelech and the 2 sons had been in before they left because of the famine. So it's been at least 10 years, maybe a little bit more. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred. It was not a real big town, but the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, M-A-R-A. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So Naomi's been gone from Bethlehem for 10 plus years. When she left, everything was great. She had a healthy husband. She had 2 healthy sons that were probably mid or upper teenagers, maybe young 20s, and they're just leaving because they want to find some food. And their anticipation when they leave is that they'll be in Moab for a short time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, however long it takes for the famine to go away. Then they'll all return and continue their happy life in Bethlehem. But we've seen what happened instead. And so 10 years later, she returns, and she's aged so much. Naomi's aged so much. Life has been so hard for her that the townspeople hardly recognize her. You know, I'm sure you've seen people that you hadn't seen for 10 years, and usually you recognize them. I mean, you may have forgotten their name, but you recognize them. Like, hey, that's, you know. But these people don't hardly recognize. They say, is this Naomi? You know, it's kind of like that. There's some little kernel of recognition there, but it's not clear. Is this Naomi? You know, and now she's come back. She's a widow. She has no children. I mean, her sons are dead too. And so it says the town is stirred. And Naomi responds, don't call me Naomi. Again, look at the meaning of the word. The meaning of Naomi means pleasant. In other words, I'm not pleasant. I'm not happy. I'm not having a good life anymore. I'm not Naomi. Call me Mara. You may remember that word. There was the waters of Mara. When the Israelites left Egypt, one of the first places they stopped was, it looked like a great place to stop and get a drink, but it was the waters of Mara. And the word Mara means bitter. And remember, they drank those waters and you know, highly magnesium waters, and apparently flushed Egypt out of them pretty good. Anyway, so she says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitters. She said, I left full, I now return empty. So far in chapter 1 here, this is one of those bad things happening to good people stories. You know, sometimes when bad things happen to us, we wonder if we're the only one. But, you know, everybody's kind of got their bad things happening to good people stories. But certainly this was exceedingly bad for Naomi to lose her husband and lose her 2 sons, because these were the source of her support as she got older. So at this point, she has lost hope. At this point, she has lost hope. She's blaming God. You know, that's often what we do when bad things happen to us. The first thing right out of the box is, how could God let this happen to me? You know, I'm becoming bitter because this has happened and this is not what I had in mind. This was not my idea of what the future would hold. You know, I'm sure Naomi's idea of what the future would hold when she went to Moab was not that her husband and both sons would die. So she's very bitter right now. And so she's telling this to Samuel, that at that point I was so bitter, I was blaming it all on God. You know, there's an old song, I think I've got the words here, and it's kind of like Naomi's leading Samuel into this old song. You know, if you remember some of the old hymns we used to sing in church, God moves in a mysterious way. Remember that old song? Let me tell you the story behind that song, because it's very interesting. That, of course, all the old hymns were written as poems, and they were put to music. So who wrote that poem was a man named William Cowper, pronounced Cooper actually, and he lived in the town of Olney, England. And he was a good friend of another man in that town named John Newton, who also wrote a lot of poems, who wrote Amazing Grace. So they were good buddies, and they both wrote a lot of poems that were turned into a lot of the old famous hymns that we've sung. Anyway, but William Cooper suffered from depression. And he had gotten so down and distressed that one night he decided to commit suicide. And he decided that apparently there was a high bridge not too far from their town. He decided he was going to jump off that bridge. But it's nighttime, and so I don't know if he didn't know the way or it was just too dark, but today we have taxi cabs, but back then they had public carriages. And so he found a public carriage and asked the carriage driver to take him to this certain bridge that was several miles out in the country. Well, about that time, a heavy, heavy fog enveloped the whole area. And so the carriage driver drove around with him in the carriage and drove around and drove around and drove around and lost his way and could never find the bridge. And so after several hours of looking and driving and not really knowing where he was, the carriage driver got so frustrated he said, I'm going to stop and you just get out because we're never going to find that bridge. And when he stopped and William Cooper got out of the carriage, he took a few steps and he was at his front door. And so that's when he went inside and wrote the poem, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, because he felt like God had a reason to keep him alive that night. Let me read you the words of that old hymn. And if you've been in churches that use the old hymn books, you'll recognize some of these words. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in the unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his gracious will. You fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. And so that's kind of how I feel like Naomi was feeling at the end of the book. Not yet, but where she is right now, she's telling Samuel, at this point in the story, I was very, very bitter. I left full, I came back empty. I'm not Naomi the pleasant one. Call me Mara, the bitter one. But she knows that as she's held Samuel this story, by the end of the 4 chapters, she's going to know that God has moved in a very mysterious way. Now, before we close tonight, I want to look at these famous couple of verses that we use in weddings a lot. You've probably heard this 100 times if you've been to a lot of weddings about what Ruth told Naomi. But I want you to look at it and let's analyze it and see how it compares to where she was previously. So, I've written here at the top of your second page. I've written this one in the New Living Translation. The one over here, exact same verses, was the English Standard. And basically, the New Living replaces live for lodge, but they mean the same thing. But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate me." Now, if you look at this and break this down, remember a while ago we said, let's look at Ruth's background. Ruth's background, her land was Moab. Her life was among people who the Jewish people considered enemies. Her lineage was a descendant of Lot, and her Lord was the god Chemosh. So in this declaration, she changes all 4 of those. Look at this. She commits to a new land. Where you go, I will go. She commits to a new life. Where you live, I will live. She commits to a new lineage. Your people will be my people. And she commits to a new Lord. Your God will be my God. And then she finishes her declaration that saying these commitments have no limit. She says, where you die, I will die. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So certainly those are good vows for marriage partners to say each other. But really, I think as Christians, these should be our vows to God. That your people will be my people. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. You will be my God. So to me, that's a phenomenal declaration. And that you can see why God allowed Ruth to be in the lineage of Christ, because she had a phenomenal character. Anyway, so you might next few week or two read through the book of Ruth a time or two. I think you'll really enjoy the story, and then next time I teach, we will kind of continue with chapter 2 and then chapter 3 and chapter 4. So we'll do this for 2 or 3 more lessons. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed that and learned something from it. Let's all stand and we'll have our closing prayer.